Good evening and welcome. Before we dive in, I would like to take a moment to invite Jose Trinidad Castañeda to do an acknowledgement of native lands. Native lands acknowledgements are intended to honor the
Good
original.
evening and welcome.
And I apologize for that. That is my feedback from my YouTube live stream, because the joys of doing these webinars from home equals some technical difficulties from time to time. So again, native land acknowledgements are intended to honor the original inhabitants of these lands. Leagues at all levels are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion in policy and in practice. And land acknowledgements are a part of our efforts towards becoming a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive organization. So Jose, take it away.
Miyam, good evening. Thank you, Natalia. My name is Jose Trinidad Castañeda, and the League of Women Voters of Santa Monica would like to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Chumash, Tongva, and Quiche peoples. We acknowledge that the Chumash, Tongva, and Quiche peoples are the traditional land caretakers, and we pay our respects to their ancestors, elders, and relations, past, present, and future.
Thank you so much, Jose. That was lovely. And I really appreciate when we have someone from the culture be able to do the land acknowledgements. So to start, we are so grateful that you're all able to join us this evening as we continue our exploration of the elephant in the room. And I'm not talking about Ellie, the purple elephant over my shoulder. I'm talking about housing. And tonight, the climate crisis as well. This is the League of Women Voters of Santa Monica's second in a monthly series discussing the causes, current issues, and potential solutions to our current housing crisis. My name is Natalia Zernitskaya, and I currently serve as the president of the League of Women Voters of Santa Monica. We're a nonpartisan but political nonprofit organization that works to support informed and active participation in government. Nonpartisan means that we do not support or oppose candidates or political parties. Tonight's event is also co-sponsored by Abundant Housing LA Education Fund and Santa Monica Spoke. Abundant Housing LA, AHLA, Education Fund is a 501c3 organization dedicated to making Los Angeles County a more affordable, diverse, and vibrant region where everyone can afford a place to live through education and grassroots advocacy. Santa Monica Spoke is a 501c3 organization dedicated to improving walking, biking, and healthy active transportation in the city of Santa Monica. Santa Monica Spoke is a community-based nonprofit working to make Santa Monica more sustainable and a better place to live, walk, bike, work, and play. Housing has been a major topic of interest for the League, especially in recent history. But as we know, it's a very large topic. This evening's focus will be on the intersections of housing and the environment. With both the housing crisis and the climate crisis continuing to negatively impact all of us, and just about a week after Earth Day, we're going to learn more about how housing policy can help us address the housing crisis, housing crisis and the climate crisis. Our panelists in order of presentations are Gloria Chung, Assemblymember Richard Bloom, Juan Matute, Jose Trinidad Castañeda, and Hank Koning and Julie Eizenberg, who will be speaking as a team. Tonight's moderator is Darlene Evans. Darlene is a longtime resident of Santa Monica, a lawyer and a community participant. She's currently a member of the League of Women Voters, the Santa Monica College General Advisory Board, Santa Monica Travel and Tourism Board, FAME Redevelopment Corporation, and the custodial chair of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Westside Coalition. Each of tonight's panelists will speak to their area of expertise, one after the other, followed by a Q&A moderated by Darlene. And in order to keep us to time this evening, we will have Kathy Gentili timing our panelists' presentations. She'll give us a heads up when the presentation has reached 8 minutes to allow the panelists to finish their remarks. And how she's going to do that is she's just going to pop up on the screen, so we're all going to get to see her and wave hi at your computer screen or however you're watching this. We have received some audience questions ahead of time. Thank you for demonstrating, Kathy. And welcome you to add your questions via the Q&A feature. And as there are sure to be many questions, we will likely not be able to get to all of them, but we do hope that you'll submit them if you have any. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Darlene to introduce our first panelist. Darlene, go ahead.
Welcome, everybody. Our first panelist is Gloria Chung. Gloria is a member of the State Board of Directors of the League of Women Voters of California and serves as second vice president for program and advocacy. In this role, she works on League of Women Voters legislative actions, including housing. Previously, she was president of her local league in San Jose and was also on the Bay Area 9 County Regional League of Women Voters board. Retired, she worked in marketing and public relations in both the private sector in Boston and in the nonprofit museum field in San Jose and Hilo, Hawaii, She also chairs the State League's Equity Task Force to bring diversity, equity, and inclusion into the operational work of the League and its leadership. Gloria?
Thank you so much, Darlene. And thank you, League of Women Voters of Santa Monica, for having me. I feel very honored to be here. Many of you, I think, recall and know Joan Leavitt, who is an active member of the Santa Monica League and a dear friend and someone who was just a champion of housing issues, and previously actually was the vice president for program and advocacy. So I feel a strong tie to you all here. Just for those of you who are not familiar with the League, we're celebrating our 101st year. The League of Women Voters grew out of the suffragette moment, and after or knowing that women were finally going to get the right to vote, and we were going to introduce 20 million at that time new voters, we needed to get our new voters up to speed. And hence the League of Women Voters was established to help bring about education and opportunities for women to understand the importance and value of voting and what the issues are. And as Natalia so beautifully explained, we are a nonpartisan organization, but we are also very political. And the political side of it is that we are interested in learning about and educating ourselves about issues that we feel are important, that affect our quality of life, affect our democracy, affect people. And we take and study these issues. And as a result of studying these issues, we create what's called the position. And through these positions, we take action. And by taking action, I mean we get involved as advocates, we write letters to the editor, we get involved with trying to shape and change policy. And this is where I think the League works very hard to shape policy that has long-term impact that will change for the better our lives. I'd like to say on behalf of the climate change side of things that the League has been very active in this area, beginning in the 60s and 70s when we were strong supporters of the Clean Air Act at the federal level, as well as the Clean Water Act, both very substantial legislative movements at the national level. We were also supportive of the creation of the EPA. This is based upon our strong belief that it's important to promote environmental benefits to life through protection and wise use and management of our natural resources in the public interest. So this is the basis for all we do, is the preservation and protection of our natural resources for the public interest. That's the basis. We also have positions on land use, energy, transportation, hazardous waste, and a number of areas that really are all involved, if you look at it, in our result, therefore, in our concerns here in California, particularly in climate change and reduction of greenhouse gases. And increasingly, for example, we're looking at what else can we do in addition to strong support for a carbon pricing system. We believe strongly in working on drawing down or getting to net carbon in terms of reducing our CO2 emissions, but actually drawing it down and absorbing it through good land use practices. In terms of the intersection now with housing, strong support for natural resources historically, but also strong support for what we call meeting basic needs, of which housing is one of them. We have watched some great concern, the decades really, and increasing over the last 10 years, the shortage of affordable and numbers, a volume of housing that is in California. We've been looking at this very carefully. It's been a issue for the concern in California for the last 2 years, and will probably continue for the next 2 years, where we're going to put concerted effort to, one, educating ourselves, being familiar with the issues, and taking it on. We're also very increasingly concerned about homelessness. We do know that every projection we looked at says that we will be 3.5 million units that are needed by 2025, which is just ahead. And this is following 10 years where the average numbers of units built were only 80,000. So we're not moving fast enough. We're going to have problems. And as a result of COVID-19, we do know that this problem has gotten just worse, driving more and more people into homelessness. So these policies we've come to recognize, if you looked at them, are historic. They're decades old. We have issues such as redlining, exclusionary zoning issues. We have policies that, if you really look at the impact, ends up being quite racist. And so what are our solutions? If you look at our concerns about climate change and natural resources, we really are looking at understanding that we need higher densities. We also need open space. And you can only have open space if we don't keep spreading out. The League has long been concerned about what had been, and I'm here in San Jose, California, which is for the longest time was the poster child for urban sprawl. So this is something that the League has really strongly taken a position on, is to urge and support higher densities. We've taken a look at legislation at the state level, but also leagues across the state of California. There's some 62 local leagues across California, are looking at what can be done at the local level. I know here in my area in San Jose, we've taken a strong look at supporting measures that will provide more monies for affordable housing. We've supported open space. We've supported greener energies through the creation of a CCA, which is a locally controlled energy. We've also supported measures, Measure AA, which would restore the San Francisco Bay, so that wetlands and the San Francisco Bay could be a retention for greenhouse gases, and also prevent sea level rising and some flooding. So these are the things that leagues do, both at the local level and at the state level. The state level, what I'm involved with, which is exciting to me, is that we look at statewide legislation. As many of you know, last year was kind of a very difficult year. Many housing bills came about and were presented. Not a whole lot of them got passed. We're thinking that a lot more will this session. I'll be interested to hear from Assemblymember Bloom to his thoughts on this. But there are things that the League does, and what it does is work through policy as well as local action and advocacy at the local as well as the state level. But I'm so pleased because I do know that Santa Monica League has been very involved with this, having this panel, for example. We need to educate ourselves and one another and our community about the critical housing shortage, lack of affordable and available housing, but we also can very much tie it into the climate change challenge that we have. And certainly a key action is to be supportive of higher density so that we don't sprawl, to be supportive of keeping open space. And as we have all seen in the past 12 to 14 months with COVID-19 limitations, open space and parks and lands like that have enabled most of us to have a better mental health and survival capability. So it is for the public good and the public interest that we in the League support actions and legislation and policies at state and local level that both address climate change mitigation opportunities as well as provision of housing. The other piece of it that increasingly the League is focused on is the issue of equity. Equity in how we do and make decisions around climate change mitigation or sustainability, and how we do our housing planning. The concerns we've increasingly seen is, as we saw with some of the redlining and some of the zoning practices, that there have been potentially negative, often have a very negative impact on certain members of the community. And so the disparities that we have seen over the last 14 months have only gotten worse. So as we examine how we come out of COVID-19, how we decide to do housing, how we do climate change, we have this other level of concern about equity. So that's kind of a quick overview of where the League is and our position, and I look forward to chatting more with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gloria. Oops. Thank you, Gloria. Our next speaker is Assemblymember Richard Bloom. And Assemblymember Bloom was first elected to the 50th District of the California State Assembly in 2012, where he represents the communities of Agoura Hills, Bel Air, Beverly Hills, Brentwood, Hollywood, Malibu, Pacific Palisades, Santa Monica, Topanga, West Hollywood, and West Los Angeles. In addition to serving as chair of the Assembly Budget Subcommittee on Resources and Transportation, Assemblymember Bloom serves on the Assembly Committee on Appropriations, Budget, Business and Professions, Higher Education, and Local Government. Richard has also served on the Legislative Budget Conference Committee, which is a small group of legislators tasked with negotiating the state budget agreement with the governor. Overall, Richard Bloom considers his top priorities to be climate change, environmental protection, congestion relief with a focus on public transit, bike, and pedestrian investment, and sub-regional connectivity, job creation, and homelessness. Sub-regional connectivity, job creation with a particular focus on the green economy, affordable housing, and homelessness. And although Assemblymember Bloom is notable, although his work in the California legislature is very important, it is also notable that he previously served on the Santa Monica City Council for 13 years, where he was chosen as mayor 3 different times. Richard?
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you for the very nice introduction, Darlene. It is an honor for me to be on this panel with so many folks that I know and a couple of new faces. The issues that we're discussing tonight are critical issues, and they're interrelated. Housing affordability and the climate crisis are 2 things that relate to one another. And of course, housing affordability and homelessness, which is a top priority for everyone today, is front and center and extremely important. Should be part of our ongoing discussion when we're talking about homelessness, because when we're talking about housing affordability, because we know that homelessness is on the increase, predominantly because more people are becoming homeless than we're able to house. And we're able to house right now record numbers of people. We're doing better on that metric than ever before. But because housing is becoming more and more expensive, we're seeing more and more people become homeless at the same time. We see that on the streets around us, and it is something that we should all find very, very troubling. And I know I don't have to explain to this group and audience why and how housing touches every aspect of our most pressing issues as a society, but it is particularly with respect to the environment. We know that 40%, roughly 40% of carbon emissions come from the built environment. So it's extremely important that when we're developing new housing, we do so with a view towards the environment. That means the way that we build. It means how dense we build. It means that we should be building close to transit so that people don't have to use automobiles as much. It means that we should be reducing parking requirements. There are a lot of implications around housing that relate directly to our climate crisis. Some recent data shows that over half of the state's 4 million renters are rent burdened, and that means that they're spending more than 30% of their income towards rent. The state is about 2.5 million units short of meeting the growing need for housing. So our need for housing is only getting more significant, not less so. And of course, these things further exacerbate the housing affordability crisis. As I said, we need to be conscientious about where we locate housing. So, for example, we want to try and avoid locating new housing in high fire zone areas. Again, why? Because we are seeing 12-month fire seasons, year-round fire seasons here in California. And we don't have to look too far to see what happens when we build in an area that is prone to fire. So the less we do of that, the better. We also don't want to disturb our open spaces that we cherish so much. And so that means that we need to build smarter and denser in our already urban areas. We also want people to be closer to their jobs so that commute times are shorter. Ideally, you want to be able to walk to work, walk to the grocery store. So we also want to build walkable communities that and bikeable communities that promote that ethic. That's what people are looking for today as well. So we also need innovative and sustainable ideas to build housing, as I said, closer to transit, with less parking, closer to jobs. And we need to do so quickly because that 2.5 million units isn't going to build itself. And that's one of the greatest barriers we have in the state. It's tough to build here. And one of my goals in the state legislature is to try and make it a little bit easier. And that's easier said than done. The last few years I've worked on and supported many bills to tackle both the housing and the environmental crisis. One of my most successful bills on housing is actually a kind of a sad statement on the state of affairs in housing. It's been very successful, and that's what I'm talking about is my bill that reformed the laws around building accessory dwelling units, granny flats. I knew that it was going to be successful, but I didn't realize just how successful it would be. Right now, there are statewide are about 18,000 new granny flats that have been built as a result of this legislation a couple of years ago. And that number is only growing. I like to joke that I've created a cottage industry, if you get it, around the reform of ADUs. But why do I find that troubling? Well, 18,000 units, I would say that there are very few other housing bills that have generated that much housing. And when you need 2.5 million units, we need to scale up far beyond the 18,000 units that we have, new housing units that we have from ADUs. So I've worked on another priority, which is we have existing housing stock that's affordable right now. Some of it is rent controlled, some of it is affordable by nature, but is becoming less affordable because as we fail to address the housing affordability crisis, costs of purchasing or renting housing continue to go through the roof. We've had a brief reprieve during COVID as people have not been able to afford their units and have moved into relatives' houses, in some cases moved out of state, but we fully expect the upward pressure on rental units to increase as we come out of COVID. We see right now the for sale market is white hot. That's because we're not building any more of those units. So there are very few affordable home ownership opportunities. And home ownership is still something that people aspire to. It's still considered the American dream, the California dream. And so it would be nice if we were to find the way forward to do that more efficiently and more effectively. It's easier and better for our environment as well if we preserve our existing affordable housing, and we don't have to use new resources to build new housing to replace those. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. I do want to return to the topic of homelessness, which is at its core a housing issue. We have legislation pending in the legislature that I am a joint author of. That's AB 71, that if successful, will provide an ongoing resource, something that's never existed before statewide, ongoing resources for building housing, and also for addressing addiction and mental health issues that are frequently co-occurring with housing issues. So I think it's time for me to wrap up. I look forward to answering questions and discussing things in more detail. And I certainly look forward to the presentations that my friends are going to be making as we move forward through this program.
Thank you, Richard. Next up is Juan Matute. Juan is Deputy Director of the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. He manages the center operations, external relations, research, and student programs. He holds an MBA and urban planning MA from UCLA. As a lecturer in urban planning, he teaches graduate classes, policy and planning for the mobility revolution, and environmental assessment for urban systems. Juan researches innovation in public transit, parking, and mobility services in response to climate change, congestion, and urban market dynamics. He led UCLA's work on 2 strategic transit plans for the state of California and long-range climate action plans for Southern California communities. Juan has worked with research teams to quantify the number of parking spaces in Los Angeles County, which must have been incredible, assess life cycle environmental impacts of the Los Angeles metro system, and examine the cost effectiveness of greenhouse gas reductions from California's high-speed rail. He also works to integrate research into practice as chair of downtown Santa Monica's Access, Mobility, and Parking Committee, which oversees mobility improvements and programs in the business district. As chair of the Los Angeles Mayor's Parking Reform Working Group, Juan coined the term "code the curb" to describe a digital inventory of street and sidewalk assets and regulations. Juan?
All right, I think I'm out of time after that introduction. That's the long version. You know, in academia, we have long CVs. So I'm going to have, so thank you for that introduction and to the League of Women Voters for inviting me. I'm going to have some slides. I'm going to go through them quickly, but you know, one of the things I get to do in teaching courses is assign homework. And so I have lots of readings should you be interested in learning more about what I'm presenting. So I was asked to talk about housing development and greenhouse gas emissions. So here's one slide that summarizes the research. Low greenhouse gas housing is near first jobs, but secondly transit, is in microclimates with less cooling demand. So that tends to be coastal California, and is in cities with higher renewable energy percentages. So cities that have CCA, such as the Clean Power Alliance, and opt in to 100% clean energy as default. And so that describes Santa Monica. And so there's 2 views of cities and greenhouse gas emissions. One is if you look at per unit of area, central cities have high greenhouse gas emissions, but on a per person basis, central cities have much lower emissions. And some of that research mentioned in that bio does look at that. And so I'm going to talk about different transportation life cycle assessments and integrated transportation land use life cycle assessments that basically just say, yeah, the research knows that that first slide is true. So one of the projects I was involved in was a life cycle assessment of the gold line and the orange line. And we found that it's much better to take light rail transit or bus rapid transit than a car. But if you take transit to, or if you take your car to the transit, it produces more greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, this is what's in the academic article. Metro liked this, they took this and they've put it in a bunch of their documents. They made it much more digestible, but we see, 20 times higher a vehicle trip greenhouse gas emissions versus a bike and light rail trip. And so that's just transportation. That's not factoring in transit-oriented development, housing construction, energy use of housing, or any of that. So we've moved in more recent years to these policy-based life cycle assessments that look at the impact of TOD. So this is Arlington, Virginia. This is just a little overview of TOD. Before they built the Metro Rail, Arlington was sprawling low-density development with lots of parking lots right over the bridge from DC. They built the Metro Rail, and 30 years after Metro Rail, this is what the neighborhood looks like, with transit-oriented development near lower density single-family zoning along that rail line. And this is the strategy that Los Angeles is taking with the expansion of the bus rapid transit, rapid bus, and light rail, heavy rail networks around. And so getting back to this life cycle assessment, when we're looking at all of these things, auto operation, building the train, operating the train, infrastructure for the train, infrastructure for the buildings, we know that we're investing a lot of emissions in the short term, and we want to know if those pay back in the longer term. And so we do something in these articles. You'll see it's an integrated transportation and land use consequential life cycle assessment is the methodology, but it really just looks at a bunch of areas surrounding building TOD and getting around and whether or not those reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the research team that I work with has actually done one for the Expo line in Los Angeles. And what do we find? Well, if you look at a variety of development scenarios for the future of a region, from the infill single-family residences near jobs, and the rezoning and multifamily mixed-use development, the multifamily mixed-use development reduces a lot more greenhouse gas emissions per unit. These are results from Phoenix. The same hold true in Los Angeles. But what's really important, and the point that I want to make, is about greenhouse gases are about 62% of the low density auto or centered development per unit on a long-term basis. But the point I really want to make is that timing matters. So we spend a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, energy, smog forming emissions by constructing light rail, TOD, et cetera. And then it starts to pay back in terms of reduced vehicle miles traveled per household because they're traveling less distance in general because they're near everything they want to be near, but also they shift towards lower emitting modes. You can use an electric car a lot better if you're not traveling long distances. And so because that timing matters and it's the cumulative stock of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere that we're concerned about, what we really want to do is front load that development, not backload it, try to get as much as possible in a period of years. So if you're an academic and you see the literature and you say, okay, this is what we know, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we need a plan to do that. The good news is that we've had a plan. We've had a plan in 2012, 2016, and 2020. That's by the Southern California Association of Governments. These are greenhouse gas constrained under SB 375. It's one of the links I've included. The Connect SoCal plan prioritizes growth in these blue areas, which tend to be nearer to jobs and transit. So that's great for greenhouse gas emissions, pedestrian reduction. It produces all of these other co-benefits with air pollution emissions, with daily vehicle miles traveled, hours of delay, there's equity benefits, all of these other things. But the greenhouse gas emissions are really what will rule the day 60 years from now when we either have a sustainable future or no future. And so one of the things that is often brought up in questions is, well, when I look at an EIR and I teach CEQA and EIR analysis for the students in the program, it always says there's going to be less traffic if I de-densify a development. So that's a project level traffic mitigation technique. And it doesn't work. The regional and traffic and greenhouse gas mitigation is by implementing transit-oriented development. But we've seen lots of issues with that. There's local challenges, and a lot of the bills that have come out of the legislature that Richard and others have worked on addressing these local challenges so that we can have a sustainable future with local decision making. And one of the things that happened a few years ago is Ben Allen, senator representing Santa Monica and surrounding areas, passed a bill, SB 150, and it was 10 years into this SB 375 that was passed in 2008. And the question was, is this working? This whole plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through integrated regional transportation and land use planning. And the answer was California is not on track to meet greenhouse gas reductions expected under SB 375. More needs to be done. One of those things was improve incentives and legal certainty for projects that provide affordable housing choices near jobs, transit, and other high opportunity locations. So the state knows what needs to happen. It's strengthened different processes to make that happen. And that's why we're seeing a need to zone for larger levels of housing and affordable housing in coastal, near transit, jobs rich communities like Santa Monica.
Okay, thank you, Juan. Okay, so next up is Jose Trinidad Castañeda, and he is the Climate Justice Policy Manager with Climate Action Campaign. Their mission is simple: stop the climate crisis. Jose also serves as Planning Commissioner in the City of Fullerton and works to end homelessness and ensure there are homes for all. For Jose, housing policy is climate policy, and he advocates that in order to foster safe and healthy neighborhoods resilient to extreme heat and drought, we must build more all-electric homes and reduce our carbon footprint with equitable land use planning. Jose.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. Once again, Jose Trinidad Castañeda. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me know if you can see. F5. All righty, so what is possible with all-electric homes near jobs and transit? Well, before we answer that, we need to ask ourselves, what is climate justice? And for me, climate justice is racial justice, it's housing justice, transit, food, disability, gender, you name it. Justice is justice, and we're not going to get to stop the climate crisis without addressing housing and land use. And so I just want to start by sharing a quick story. Back in, I believe it was 2017, if not 2018, there was one of the greatest heat waves that Southern California has ever faced. And it was around 117 degrees Fahrenheit in where I live in Fullerton. So I was called to volunteer for the community emergency response team. We were running a cooling center out of our community center. And all throughout the day, you know, it was just a small group of us, 4 or 5 volunteers. All we had was a first aid kit, some bottles of water, and good company. And as the heat wave started to continue and the day went on, paramedics, firefighters, police officers brought people who were experiencing severe heat-related illnesses, heat stroke, heat exhaustion, and other symptoms to the cooling center for recovery. There were many cases of people going to the hospital then, so our public safety officers brought them to us. And I will always remember one gentleman who had passed out on a sidewalk in downtown Fullerton. And he had been laying there for around 5 or 7 minutes. But when the temperatures are 117 degrees Fahrenheit, the surfaces of our streets and sidewalks are even higher. And even in that short amount of time, until someone was able to assist him, he developed second-degree burns on his face, his arms and legs. And by the time that he got to the cooling center, we were tasked with treating him as though it was an emergency room. And I remember he needed so many ice packs, so much water. He was delirious from the heat exhaustion, heat stroke. And fortunately, his life was saved by getting him to cooler spaces. And I will never forget the fear that I had that this will continue and more people would suffer just as this gentleman had. And throughout the rest of the day, it was retirees, mobile home residents, families living in small apartments with no air conditioning units that continue to come into our cooling center. And I wanted to share that story with you because I believe that's what the heart of our housing and climate crisis is, that if we don't have energy efficient, all electric homes that people can, go to live in and take shelter from heat waves, drought, extreme heat events or weather events, then we're going to be left with people facing greater levels of suffering. And so I want to focus on equity in our housing and climate discussion, and that we know that if everyone spends less time on the road, state climate officials don't assume everyone is going to spend less time on the road. They're planning for California to spend more time on the road. And for many to abandon cars altogether. But for that to happen, we need more people to live where they work or shop, and more housing in urban neighborhoods and job centers, while the population continues to grow just from people who were born here, people who are immigrating here, and refugees seeking shelter. So reducing VMTs, vehicle miles traveled, is necessary, and electric cars are not going to solve it. So we need to focus on land use. We know we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions from urban infill. It's actually one of the most impactful local policies that city councils and county supervisors can take compared to electric vehicles, which is just a few bars below. Vehicle miles traveled has to go down by 11 billion miles per year from our current number, about 31 million miles per day. That's the equivalent of taking more than 1 million vehicles off the road completely in our state. And we can no longer continue to ignore an inconvenient truth that our climate goals are being undermined by land use regulations that block urban infill, and sprawl, which is easier to build and cheaper, is growing more quickly. So in order to combat the climate crisis, we must combat urban suburban sprawl and support infill housing in our cities with our job centers and transit centers. I just said that, but in addition to that, making sure that we are really focused on increasing density and reforming our ADUs. One of a proud achievement that I have is that after that experience where I treated a man who had passed out on the sidewalk during that heat event, I really made an effort to address housing at a systemic level. And so I went to my city council meeting and I told them how many barriers there are for me to even build an accessory dwelling unit. And I did my homework, learned that our city was charging an arm and a leg, over $12,000 in just excess fees in order to build an accessory dwelling unit. And that could, stop someone from even considering that. So I advocated for 5 months, got a few community members together, and eliminated that excess fee. It turned into inspiration for statewide legislation, and I've continued that ever since. I've continued to advocate, educate, and organize. So in order to address VMTs and our climate, we have to create more walkable, bikeable neighborhoods with world-class transit systems, with ADUs where we have single-family homes, and denser homes where it's appropriate. So again, take action, educate your neighbors, your family members, your friends, advocate at your city council meetings, at your supervisor meetings, and organize. Get involved with your housing element update. All of Southern California cities are updating their housing elements and deciding where they can upzone for more climate-friendly housing, and sign up for updates. If you don't know where to start, go to Abundant Housing LA They're a great resource for us all in the LA County region. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jose. Our final speakers of the evening are Julie Eizenberg and Hank Koning, the founding principals of Koning Eizenberg Architecture. They are Santa Monica residents for over 40 years and have worked to transform mundane programs into spacious places of ease and generosity that strengthen neighborhoods. Notable local projects include the Arroyo, Ashland Apartments, and Pico Branch Library. The firm has been honored as the American Institute of Architects California's Firm of the Year and recognized nationally and internationally with over 190 design and sustainability awards. Hank and Julie were awarded the AIA Los Angeles Gold Medal in 2012 and the Australian Institute of Architects Gold Medal in 2019. Their work is published widely in the US and abroad, and monographs include Architecture Isn't Just for Special Occasions, that was in 2006, and Urban Hallucinations in 2017, which provide added insight into the firm's work. Julie and Hank.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all the previous panelists. I have to put the screen up. I'm sorry, I have to put the screen up. So I'm going to talk a little bit, it may be duplicating a little bit of what Jose and Juan talked about, and I'm going to share my screen if I can work out how to do that. Here we go. Can you see that? Hello? I'm not getting a response, Julie. Hello, can we see the screen?
No.
No, we can't.
You can't. Okay, what have I done wrong?
You didn't say go back again.
Okay, I've lost the other screen.
Yeah, it's.
I have. Julie, could you fix that up?
Yeah, I'm gonna try.
Okay, sorry about that. But I want to talk briefly about, and I'm a bit duplicating what Juan talked about, was the issue of greenhouse gas emissions. Share screen. Oh, hang on, go to that one. Here we go. Now, can you see the screen?
Yes.
Ah, brilliant, brilliant. Okay, great. Let's go to the second slide just to get moving. So I sort of did a quick non-academic, not particularly scientific thing on the issue of your carbon footprint. And I found this from the Nature Conservancy. And I thought this was very poignant. It calculates how much carbon dioxide and methane you produce, you emit. USA average is 16 tons per person. Globally, it's 4 tons per person. And to avoid an increase of 2 degrees Celsius by 2050, we have to be an average footprint of 2 tons. Then they mention things that you can do, like eat less meat, less connecting flights, and line drying your clothes, etc. But I think there are more bigger areas where we can improve on that. And I
went too far.
Did I go too far? No. I'm going to talk about our house. They had a little calculator for how much footprint you have. And the dashed lines that you see in here is the typical home or similar homes. You can see that travel is the biggest greenhouse gas emitter, then the home. Food, goods and services, they can't be controlled by housing policy, so we'll focus on the first two. And I filled in what we did. We ended up with 30 tons per year. We're 3 people, so we're at a 10-ton level. And you'll see that the traffic one is where we do the best job of doing that. And that's because we live half a mile from where we work and we share a car. And we often walk, ride bike or carpool to the office. And that's the biggest factor in saving. So the issue, and we're in a single family home, but that's the same deal applies. Now, I've had a lot of people say, well, with COVID, a lot of people are working from home. So that's going to change everything. People are going to continue to do so. But then Joel Cochran, who's a presidential fellow in urban studies at Chapman University, said that post-COVID, you're not going to see 40% of people working at home. You're likely to see 20% at home, and you'll see a lot of hybrid. So that helps. That helps, but it's not the big significant, be-all solution to it. The second category we have is the home, and you'll see we are less than a similar home. And that's because we have photovoltaic panels, we have solar hot water, we're using green power. We don't have air conditioning, we have a lot of cross ventilation, trees and shade structures. Some of these we apply to obviously our multifamily. The trees is more challenging, but the idea of cross ventilation and generating power, we continue into our multifamily projects as well. And we take that over. So Julie's going to show you some of those projects and how we incorporate some of those things that we've done on our house into those projects.
So some of these design strategies kind of appear invisible, except they're embedded in a lot of the regulations. So this is Santa Monica. Look, you've got to give it to Santa Monica. We're progressive in terms of adoption of principles in the, on waste recycling, urban runoff and LEED and stuff. We're a little behind on cars, and we were at the forefront of affordability, but affordability still remains a really high objective that it's harder and harder to meet. So I'll start with 500 Broadway, which is a market rate development of about 250 units. And this was developed, where's the clicker here? And the real key here is that typical developments basically build a courtyard, and they build a street wall, which we all thought was a great idea. And they take massing so it decreases as you go up, so that the building steps back. What we do know that if we use passive design techniques to limit the amount of energy use that we will need, what we want is the airflow that goes between buildings. And what we want to do is be good neighbors to the people who are behind us. And to do that and to get the orientations right, we need to make sure that the regulations that we make under the housing element ensure flexibility and ability to change as we get more information. So what we're calling here cross-grain massing is what characterizes 500 Broadway. Shade is really important in our kind of climate, and building that into the regulations is also important. And shade applies also to window opening. So if you're facing west, having screens that slide across the windows to stop solar gain is a really big way of reducing your energy load. And roofs are now too valuable to waste. You need them for photovoltaics. So wedding cake plans that make the footprint, make the top of the building small and the bottom aren't necessarily the best strategy. And the recreation ability and the greening of roofs is great for wellness and quality of life. This building is in construction now, and it's using a moment frame steel frame system where the components can be way in the future pulled apart and reused. The Arroyo is an affordable housing development, and it's actually part of the inclusionary housing program that was associated with 500 Broadway. So it was just around the corner. It needed to be adjacent to transit, the same kind of location that the market rate development had, and it provides housing for large families, and it has a means tested income, and I think it's around 30% average mean income, LA County. So the Arroyo uses the same principles that we used at 500 Broadway, except that the open space is really purposed here to deal with children. It has sunshades which add ornament as well as reduce energy heat gain. It uses open bridge and exterior circulation so that you're not air conditioning circulation space, and it creates a sense of community. What you're looking at here is actually why this project was called the Arroyo. It was called the Arroyo because underneath this is the old Arroyo Canyon, which had the seasonal water flow. Now underneath this building is a 7-foot storm drain, which happened in the 60s. I couldn't control everything. On the roof, photovoltaics. Both of these projects that I'm showing you are LEED Platinum. So the really key thing is if you have an opportunity to build, you have to build well, because it's a privilege that's too important to waste. In a project like the Arroyo, the planning of the open space and how children and families could play and learn together was very important. And then finally, the last kind of housing I just want to show you is what they used to call, well, we kind of call missing middle. Missing middle housing is about the kind of housing that is at a lower density, but not as low a density as single family housing. And it is also cheaper. Now, the deal is if you're in Santa Monica, the real estate is so expensive that even this kind of density isn't available to my kids or most of your kids to participate in. And it's really important that we have it. I think it's really important in housing policy that the city of Santa Monica looks at making the regulations around condominiums less, because no matter which way we cut it, ownership is a leg up in the economic system. And we need to be able to have that ability for more and more people. So I guess I'm kind of showing you a sort of a cross section of housing types and housing needs. Affordability affects all sectors. It's not just for the lowest income earners, which I think is the most urgent need and what we've been working with for a long, long time. But it also now is to do with kids in their 30s. And they may even be like tech workers earning good money. They still can't afford to live in our community. So we have to start thinking about this more carefully. We need to be thinking about smaller units. We need to be thinking about open space. And I think that's kind of it. Thank you.
I thought you had more slides.
Thank you.
Oh, we have to stop sharing.
Yeah.
Stop sharing. I think we have to get rid of that.
Are you done?
We're
Yeah,
done. We're done. We're gonna.
Okay. Thank you, Hank and Julie. Now we can start the question and answer portion of our program. And we've received some questions from the public before today's meeting. And if you have additional questions, you can put them, I guess, in the chat. But if you, so we can get to them. We won't get to them all because the meeting will end at 7:30. But we wanted to start with some questions. And Hank and Julie, you might have an opinion about this. This one says, my son is a real estate developer and he would like to be proactive on issues of the environment. About 6 years ago, he put solar panels on the roof of one of his new apartment buildings. However, the LA Department of Water and Power informed him that adding solar panels would mean that they would reclassify his building as commercial rather than residential, which caused him to not put solar panels on any of his additional buildings, and it would have caused the reclassification obligated him to make greatly increased payments to them to cover additional fees and taxes. The question is that appropriate? Is that actually legal? And they were hoping that the city would re-examine its policies with an eye to facilitating rather than impeding the addition of solar panels to new residential buildings. Are you aware of this, Hank or Julie?
No, not aware of it. We have put solar panels on residential projects and they are classified as residential projects. But that's in the city of Santa Monica. We've done it in Pasadena.
Yeah.
I think of one we've done in LA, but that's, in my opinion, the most absurd thing I've ever heard.
Does anybody else have a response? Okay. So that's not something we know about, but hopefully it's something that won't continue because it seems to go against the whole point of environmentalism. Okay, next question. due to the housing crisis and the pandemic, has there been any discussion about legislation that might allow a greater amount of time to implement the housing requirements for the housing element? Richard, I'll give that one to you.
Well, there have been discussions around extending various time limits. I can't be specific about what they are, but there are some time limits that people are not able to meet because of the restrictions that COVID has placed on us. And so to the extent those are related to housing, they might be relevant in answering the question that you're asking. But in so far as the housing element itself is concerned, these are 8-year cycles. And I don't believe there's any discussion currently about extending the current 8-year cycle. And in fact, most housing planning and construction is proceeding apace. There's been no slowdown in construction. In fact, many people are taking advantage of this period of time to build.
How can I don't
Yes,
know if I'm
yeah, go ahead, jump in.
I've got to say though that from the amount of time from a start of a project to an end of a project in Santa Monica, we need community scrutiny, but it is way too long and it's unnecessarily too difficult to achieve. And I think that is a real impediment to meeting the goals. And I don't think it should be hidden behind COVID. This is something that was a problem before and it remains a problem.
I don't think you should pick on Santa Monica.
Okay, I won't.
LA City, LA County are equally culpable in this, and we're doing affordable housing projects, and it takes so long to get approvals. We're never going to solve the problem of housing without something being done that gets rid of stupid codes and stupid processes. And in terms of the issue, I know we have a project that we submitted in Santa Monica for housing, and normally they have 30 days under the Permit Streamlining Act. We've been told that those requirements don't apply due to the COVID emergency. So I understand that that's a problem, but I also understand that the housing situation's a bigger problem.
I couldn't agree with Hank and Julie more. I think the time it takes, particularly for multifamily projects, from the beginning of planning to the completion of the project is many years in length. In the construction world, time is money. So it increases, it not only delays the opening of projects, but it increases the costs. And when it comes to construction costs today for example, for affordable housing, we're looking at increasing costs almost on a monthly basis, not all of which is within our control. Some of the increased costs now, as I'm sure Hank and Julie will attest to, are in the cost of materials. The cost of wood, I think, is 110% beyond what it was about a year ago. So there are a lot of things that conspire to lead to escalation of costs to where right now it's costing, depending on the cost of land, somewhere between $500,000 and $600,000 per door, per unit of affordable housing. That makes it extremely expensive to build. It stretches our very limited dollars for affordable housing further. If we can help lower those costs by for example, using modular housing, which is a emerging technology, we can change that dynamic a little bit. But the cost of producing housing is through the ceiling right now.
Thank you. I have a question for you, Gloria. With housing elements being discussed in our cities at this time, how can we best advocate for equitable housing policies and change minds in city councils and planning groups?
Thank you. That's sort of interesting. I did listen to a presentation done by a local planner here in our area. And he talked about the fact that all this discussion on housing, and we call them opportunity housing zones where we can increase density, have really caused a real pushback by a lot of communities. And he said, you know, we need to rethink how we present this information and how we go about selling it, if you will, because the concept of fear that is created about housing restrictions in terms of zoning changes have really gotten a lot of people upset. We need to talk about it in a different language, perhaps, and that would be talking about, he called it the new urbanism or the pragmatic urbanism, where we can talk about the needs for creating housing that reaches everybody and satisfy the need for people 8 to 80. And he gave me one statistic that I found interesting, that in our area, in 1970s, 2/3 of the population had families with children. Today, it's 1/3. So the concept of building these large homes as single family homes just don't work in today's world. So we need to help the discussion. I think leagues need to help the discussion by bringing about good information, stop the scaremongering that is happening and the fear that is happening, and just provide a voice of information that is pragmatic and help shift the conversation and also deal with. I mean, I think the discussion today is this is important not only for housing, but also for climate change and for reasons of equity. I think people sometimes don't think beyond their own personal needs. And so I think if league members can help with that discussion, help broaden the discussion. So we're talking about creating environments that are going to be healthy for us, that are going to meet the needs for the future as well as now, because the future is saying we're not going to have these large communities with children at the level at which we'd had 20 years ago.
Thank you.
Can I also chime into that? Because that was such an important question. Equity must be at the center of how we plan for the future. Everyone knows their neighborhood and community best. So I'm not going to speak on, this is where you should put your housing or upzone here or not. But when we see the history of racial segregation and racial injustice over the course of decades, that's not something we can continue to ignore any further if we're going to have justice. And with more affluent areas along the coast, whether that's in Santa Monica, Malibu, or even down to Newport Beach and Orange County, all along the South Coast, we must make more of an effort to build more housing, more low and moderate income housing in those affluent communities. And the way that we can do that, we've mentioned it before, Assemblymember Bloom has mentioned the ADU reforms, even turning these large single family homes with only 1 or 2 people living in them into a duplex where they can share part of the home. I know that a lot of people are fearful of having new members of the community live nearby, but ultimately, we also have to talk about economic and financial security and stability with a lot of homeowners that are aging beyond the work years. My dad, for example, I really worry that he needs to have some sort of income into his retirement in addition to what he's already saved for retirement. And absolutely, housing presents a huge opportunity to not only house the people that grew up in the neighborhoods that they want to continue to live in, but also bring in some extra income for those who need it. So I really want to encourage that when we talk about equity, equity for me means that those low income families, very low income and even moderate income families can stay and age in place in the neighborhoods they know best until they decide that they want to leave for better opportunities. But for the most part, this is California we're talking about. In Santa Monica, I've met people from around the world that shared with me they moved to Santa Monica because that was their dream. That was the biggest dream in the world, was to live there. And I'm sure it's going to continue to be that way even as climate change impacts our neighborhoods. But for that, I'll leave it with equity at the heart of all the decisions. Please be open to more housing in the more affluent areas for our low and moderate income families.
Thank you, Jose. I have a question for Juan and Richard, which says, can you please explain where there is any evidence that increasing density creates more affordability? I see no evidence of trickle-down affordability. What I do see are cities where land values and rents and housing costs increase with density increases as well. Either one of you gentlemen can jump in at any time.
Juan, do you want to start?
Yeah, I've been providing a lot of links. So I was quickly looking to find a link on that. And so, because I know that my colleagues in the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies have been doing a lot of work on this. So with child in hand, this is the quickest I can find. But study after study has shown there's different types of neighborhood development that you can build. And what we tend to do in California and Los Angeles is we really restrict the supply. And so where we do have growth, that growth is inhibited. And that growth is inhibited where there's less housing being built than is demanded. So you may see rents go up because there's not enough new supply where the effects of the amenities of essentially the gentrification of the neighborhood is not drowned out by an increase in supply. That's a very localized effect. What you find is if you go a few blocks over, the rent pretty much always goes down. But that's where you find, if you just do piecemeal new development in Hollywood, in Santa Monica, the rents of those new developments stays kind of high. But if you were to add much more development commensurate with demand in that neighborhood, you wouldn't see that effect. And anywhere you do that study where you're adding that development, and this link is a great roundup of that, you see lower rents even in the brand new developments.
Richard, do you want to add anything, or is that good?
Well, I think that's it's good, but we're clearly seeing more demand than there is supply, we experience that on a daily basis. My son is currently looking for an apartment, and wherever he has gone, there have been multiple people ahead of him who are putting money down, deposits down. One person in a apartment he was looking at put down enough money for a year's worth of rent as a deposit in order to win the apartment. Wow. Clearly demand is outstripping the supply, and nowhere is that more true than in the affordable housing world. We're about 1.5 million units short of affordable housing, deed restricted affordable housing. And because people can't, on the lower ends of the economic spectrum, those who are making the least amount of money, and people who who do make a decent amount of money depend on for so many different things, those folks are faced in many cases with paying 40, 50, 60% of their net spendable income on their housing costs. And this is causing them to become even more impoverished, and in many cases, dropping out of housing completely and ending up on the street. And we wonder why we have a homeless crisis that is as extensive and as visible as it is. And this is one of the reasons, one of the main reasons.
Thank you. How much density is too much density in terms of impacting the quality of life? So, well, actually, it's a two-part question. Please define density in terms of, is it just going up higher? Is it more places packed together? What does density mean in the housing context? And two, how much density is too much density? Or is there too much? And
can I start this off? And I don't want to commandeer the conversation, but I think it's pretty safe to say in many cases it's in the eye of the beholder. So there are some folks who don't want to see a duplex next door. That's too much density. And there are some people who are concerned about a 5-story apartment building on a boulevard down the street. So it really depends.
Anyone else want to jump in?
Well, I'd ask the architects, because there is a point at which the building systems require more energy for a very, very large skyscraper, perhaps, than per unit than perhaps they would.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because my next question was going to be, what is the environmental impact of this additional housing and density? And I'll give this to you, Julie and Hank, in terms of, is there a point at which you reach diminishing returns on the environment if you build a great number of housing? And right now we're close to 9,000 units that have to be built in the next 8 years. Is that too much? What is the impact on the environment for that housing and the infrastructure?
We've got to go back to what Juan said, which was it's a long-term payoff. So you can't measure it in what you're doing today. What you're looking at is a long-term stuff. That said, Richard's right too. This is in the eye of the beholder, and there's a lot of fear about it. And but the part that's not well understood is that quality of life for everyone is actually tied to an increased density, so that there's some economy in the services that make a walkable community work. And this is something that's really hard to understand. And it feels like all you're doing is giving the benefit that you have of, you were here first, and then all these other people are coming in. They're actually providing benefit for you. It just doesn't seem that way. They're providing benefit because they make the economics of the bread store that you want to go to, or the dry cleaners that you can walk to. All of these things are all intertwined. It's not one thing and then the rest all is a completely separate problem. I'll leave it to you, Hank.
Many years ago, David Owen did a book called Green Metropolis, and he analysed the environmental impacts of somebody living in an old New York apartment building and somebody living in a brand new suburban house with all the, energy code requirements. And the New York apartment building, the people living there had much less environmental impact in terms of greenhouse gas, even though it didn't have, the whiz-bang modern air conditioning and insulation and stuff like that. So that's a reality. And, the problem is it's such a dire problem. So we need density. And yeah, unfortunately, it means there's some changes going to happen. And I think architects have a responsibility to make that change as attractive as possible. I know in Santa Monica, when we did the 2012 loose, we said, let's preserve the residential neighborhoods, keep that housing, the existing housing stock, because it's affordable, and let's build on the boulevards and have density. It would have less impact. It's near transit, etc. That is what we need to do. We just have to do a better job of communicating to folks who are resistant to that notion that change will be positive, as Julie said.
Thank you.
So let me add one brief comment.
Go ahead.
Because of my job, I live in two places. So I have a home in Santa Monica and I have a home in Sacramento. The home in Santa Monica is a single family residence with an ADU in the backyard. Actually, the ADU that inspired me to carry that legislation that reformed the law. That's another story for another time.
Was it legal, Richard?
What's that?
Was it a legal ADU, Richard?
It was built with a permit in 1940. I don't know how legally it was built. It was pretty ramshackle when we got here in 1981, when we got to Santa Monica. But I live in a apartment in a 14-story building in Sacramento, in a area that is populated by both commercial high rises and low rises and high rise apartment buildings. And it's fabulous. It works for me. It's great. So all of these things can work together. And I think that, for some people, it might take some getting used to, but I certainly agree with Hank that we need to focus our density on boulevards as much as possible. And there are some other strategies that we can follow as well.
On that same topic, and we only have a few minutes left, so I'll get to the last couple of questions, but should density be imposed by the state or local communities?
I'd like to jump in on that
Go ahead,
before
Jose.
member. If we, so right now, local control and the control over housing and zoning already is within the power and authority of our city councils and communities. So why do we still have a housing crisis if the solution was always, that our local communities should have control over it? If that were the case, then we wouldn't have a housing crisis if local communities were able to solve it. So the state has to step in and address this because we're way beyond an inflection point where we needed to address the housing crisis. So people are dying, and whenever I hear, we need more local control over housing and land use decisions. So you already have it, then do something with it. And yeah.
Good point. Go ahead, Juan.
And local control is really just a talking point. The idea that a city council can determine its own zoning and density, I think we've seen with the current piece of legislation, SB 10, which there was a question in the chat about minimizing CEQA lawsuits. Well, SB 10, right now you can build a house pretty much anywhere in California without a single neighbor being able to sue that house over CEQA issues. SB 10 would do that with missing middle housing to allow you to, that kind of housing that Hank and Julie showed, that's a little bit more dense than a single family, but not a large project. And it only allows cities that choose to declare that a ministerial project and therefore exempt from CEQA and exempt from a single lawyer deciding to sue the project. It allows cities to choose to do that. And Santa Monica and many other cities opposed that bill, even though it would give city councils more local control. It would take away the control over of individuals who wish to sue, but that's not the definition of local control. And so I think a lot of these local control debates are really just proxies for something else.
And I just want to add that I don't think that the climate crisis and the housing crisis is a city problem. It's a regional problem. It's a state problem. The climate crisis is a global problem. And if the cities can't do it alone.
As is homelessness is not a local city problem. The housing affordability crisis does not exist just in one community. It's everywhere in the state. So this is another place where I have a foot in both camps, if you will. I come from local government. I was the mayor of Santa Monica. I understand why we want to retain as much local control to meld our communities, to respect the desires and wishes of our constituents. But when there's a crisis and local governments are not adequately addressing that crisis, then that is an appropriate place for the state to step in. And if the state doesn't step in, then in many of these situations, the problem continues to snowball and grow.
Thank you very much for your comments. And I'm going to just do one last round robin question for everybody. And please keep your responses brief, but we would like to know if you had a magic wand and you could change housing policy, one thing overnight, what would it be? And I'll start with you, Gloria.
Well, it's something that the league has been talking a lot about, and that is at a state level, removing making it a lot easier to remove single family housing zoning restrictions.
Juan?
Yeah, I think if you asked me 5 years ago, I wouldn't have agreed with Gloria, but in so many cities, we've slowed down growth on the boulevards through all of this local opposition that I think it's made that the need to have growth in the single family neighborhoods. And at the same time, our understanding of the racial implications of that original zoning has increased and only furthered the imperative.
Julie and Hank?
I'm going to put the counter argument. I think we have to push harder for more density on the boulevards We need to keep the idea of the garden suburb, which is what underlies a single family house. I don't care who lives there, don't care how many people live there, but I think to have a variety of housing types and that has green space. So I would say that it's about a volume of area, or however you want to define it, that's equitable. And whether it's one house, three houses, whatever it is, I don't care. But I believe if we don't get density on the boulevards, we're not going to have enough units. I think Richard mentioned 18,000 that have come around for
ADUs. Yeah.
Not enough, not fast enough, and not enough people accounted for.
My magic wand would be that it doesn't take 10 years to get a housing project entitled and permitted.
Oh,
okay.
You dreamer, you.
Okay.
It's a magic wand. He can
perhaps,
choose.
but anyway, yeah.
Richard?
Dramatically scale up the production of affordable housing.
Jose?
I'd pass SB 5, the Affordable Housing Bond of 2022 from Senator Atkins, because we need to fund affordable housing at deeper levels. That's one of the biggest barriers to low income, very low income, permanent supportive housing development projects.
Very good. And
I just want to add one more thing. Gloria mentioned Joan Leavitt, and my other big wish would be to bring Joan Leavitt back, because I've never met an advocate for affordable housing that was as wonderful as she was.
That's so wonderful. Thank you so much. Natalia, I'm going to turn it back over to you because I think I've reached my time.
Thank you so much, Darlene, and thank you so much to our fabulous panelists, Gloria, Richard, Juan, Jose, Julian, Hank. I've learned a lot. I've heard so much I haven't been able to process it all, and I'm going to have to rewatch it again a couple times to get everything. So thank you. And thank you to Kathy, our timer. Thank you to our co-sponsors and our Housing Series Committee, including Barbara, who's the only person whose name I didn't mention yet. And to the folks that are watching and listening to this, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. We appreciate that you chose to give priority to our panelists this evening over the president's speech to the nation. And of course, we know that you're probably recording the president's speech to listen to it later. And we know that those of you who chose to listen in real time to the president are rewatching this on YouTube. So thank you for watching as well. We hope that you'll join us at our third event in this series on the topic of housing elements, which you did hear a couple folks mention this evening. I'm going to drop the RSVP link in the chat. If you're not yet a member of the League, we invite you to join, which you can do at our website at lwbsantamonica.org/join. We hope you have a fabulous rest of your evening, and we will see you next month. Bye, folks.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thanks for having me.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you.